Urbanization, a consequence of the industrialization, the massive internal and global migrations that fueled the new economic order, largely defined the United States and other industrializing nations of the world in the late 19th century. The Gilded Age proved to be the pivotal period for the transition from rural to urban society, a trend that continued well into the 20th century. Cities grew both horizontally, sprawling across the landscape, and vertically as new, taller buildings seemed to pierce the sky. They became increasingly segregated and fragmented by class, race, and ethnicity. The rapid growth of cities reconfigured and transformed the landscape and culture in troubling ways to contemporary observers. While cities embodied late 19th century notions of progress and modernity, at the same time their growing dominance challenged the traditional Jeffersonian vision of a nation as a land of rooted, rural peoples. While cities throughout the industrializing world grew during the course of the 1800s, urbanization accelerated rapidly in the last 30 years of the century. At the midpoint of the 19th century, only two cities claimed a population of more than 2 million people, and that was London and Paris. By the turn of the 20th century, New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia in the US, along with Berlin, Tokyo, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Buenos Aires, and Osaka, had reached or were fast approaching that mark. In addition to the growth of massive metropolitan areas around the world, towns and cities of all sizes, from industrial cities to trading centers and county seats, also expanded. But the great cities, as they were called, those with a population of more than 100,000 people, most often captured both the imagination of the public and stoked its fears. Just as Great Britain pioneered industrial capitalism, it led the way in urbanization. As early as 1800, London claimed 1 million people. By 1890, 3 of 4 people in England lived in an urban area. By contrast, on the eve of the Civil War, only 1 in 5 Americans, roughly 6.2 million people, lived in an urban area, defined liberally as a town or city of 2,500 or more. By 1900, 30 million Americans, or 2 of every 5, dwelled in cities. Even though the South and parts of the West remained largely rural, by 1890 the U.S. was as urbanized as Belgium. By 1880, New York became the first American city to reach 1 million inhabitants, followed by Chicago and Philadelphia in 1890. The country's great cities also jumped significantly, from 14 in 1870 to 38 by 1900. But as rapidly as urbanization occurred in the US, cities in other parts of the world matched or outstripped it. Berlin, for example, grew roughly as fast as New York and reached 1 million people by the turn of the century. Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Lodz in the Russian Empire even outpaced Chicago's phenomenal development by growing more than 800% between 1870 and 1900. In all these cases, migrants from the countryside, both internally and internationally, flowed into cities and were the key factor in explosive urban growth. Overpopulation of the countryside, coupled with agricultural mechanization, in which machines replaced farm labor, forced rural peoples to look to cities for work. Worldwide economic depressions also deeply hurt farmers, who lost their farms when they could not pay creditors. For those better off, especially for ambitious young men, towns and cities in the industrial age seem to offer unlimited business prospects and the chance to enjoy new technology, such as electricity, telephones, and a whole range of cheap leisure activities, such as amusement parks and vaudeville theater. In the U.S., African Americans continued to flow into cities. Approximately 341,000 blacks migrated from the South to the North between 1870 and 1900, a small migration compared to what would follow in the 20th century, beginning in the era of World War I. But many more blacks migrated from the countryside to southern towns and cities where, like their white counterparts, they sought new opportunities. The South's fastest growing cities, such as Atlanta and Nashville, had larger populations of young blacks who tended to leave rural areas more often than their parents. A small black middle class, made of business people and professionals, also developed in these cities. Atlanta's Auburn Ave and Charlotte's Second Ward, for example, featured black-owned businesses such as pharmacies and banks, and the offices of doctors, dentists, and lawyers. Even menial service jobs designated for blacks in cities, such as domestic labor, waiting tables, and shining shoes, provided a bit more opportunity and freedom than sharecropping did. But immigrants from around the world especially expanded the size of towns and cities in the Gilded Age. Most of the 11 million immigrants who arrived in the U.S. between 1870 and 1900 settled in cities, where they were most likely to find employment. The great majority were Europeans, but Chinese, until their exclusion in 1882. Japanese, Canadian, and Mexican migrants were also lured to the U.S. in hopes of jobs and a better future. By 1900, 60% of those who dwelled in the nation's 12 largest urban centers were either foreign-born or had parents who were foreign-born. In some cities, such as Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit, 4 out of 5 residents fell into that category. Reflecting the massive economic transformations of the era, the industrial metropolis emerged as the typical city in this period. The 3 largest American cities in 1900, New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, all featured diversified industry, business districts, and residential neighborhoods increasingly segregated by class, race, and ethnicity. Chicago, even more than its older East Coast counterparts, epitomized the new metropolis. With a population of roughly 4,000 when it was chartered as a city in 1837, this sleepy, dusty trading town on the shores of Lake Michigan boasted 100,000 residents by 1860. 20 years later, the city had grown to 500,000 people despite a devastating fire in 1871. And in just 10 years, from 1880 to 1890, Chicago doubled its population to 1 million people, making it the nation's second largest city. Ideally situated on the edge of the country's industrial and manufacturing belt to the east and rich farmlands to the west, Chicago emerged as a rail hub and teemed with products from western farms and forests. Enterprising citizens constructed grain elevators, manufacturing plants, and slaughterhouses, establishing a massive empire of trade both nationally and internationally. But market and credit networks kept cities such as Chicago inextricably linked to the countryside. Even as residents of the city and country increasingly thought of themselves as different types of Americans, and often as rivals, economic ties established a mutual dependency. While the industrial metropolis cast a huge shadow, it was not the only type of city that grew at a remarkable rate. Just as railroads powered the growth of the nation's metropolises, they also fueled the expansion of smaller cities. Reflecting larger economic trends, these second-tier cities specialized in manufacturing or processing particular products for regional, national, and international markets. Only the South remained largely rural, although it too experienced great urban growth in the Gilded Age. In 1900, only 17% of Southerners lived in a town or city, and the region contained only 11% of the nation's urban population. The inland cities of Atlanta, Charlotte, and Nashville emerged as quintessential New South cities. Small, modest railroad towns at the time of the Civil War, these cities exploded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as trading cities with some industry. They attracted relatively few immigrants, but drew many white migrants from the countryside, many of whom worked in textile mills. Atlanta, for example, grew by a remarkable 1,500% from less than 10,000 people to 155,000 between 1860 and 1900. New South cities soon challenged the dominance of the Old South's largest cities, coastal cities such as Charleston and New Orleans, but New South cities remained relatively small, especially by national standards. New Orleans remained the region's largest city in the Gilded Age, but only the 12th largest city in the nation. The late 19th century city differed dramatically from earlier urban centers in its spatial patterns, sprawl, and vertical growth. Earlier in the century, most cities were compact walking cities. Urbanites lived within walking distance of jobs, stores, and businesses, all located in the city core. City limits extended only as far as people could travel on foot, rarely beyond 2 miles. Businesses, homes, and factories all shared space in these densely populated areas, and people of all classes, races, and ethnicities lived and worked in close quarters. Transportation innovations, especially the streetcar, transformed American cities. First implemented in Richmond, Virginia in 1888, the electric streetcar made it possible to work and shop in the city center while living on its fringes, in suburbs miles away from congestion and grime. Electric-powered subways, first introduced in Boston in 1897, provided another source of cheap urban transportation, as did elevated streetcars and cable cars. Gilded Age cities began to sort out by class, race, ethnicity, and land use. Wealthier white residents separated themselves from poorer urban dwellers, especially immigrants and people of color, abandoning the city center, once the most desirable place to live because of its proximity to jobs and services. They flocked to quiet, clean, and new residential developments in suburbs, residential developments outside of city limits, easily accessible by streetcars. Suburbanization, along with urbanization, was an important characteristic of Gilded Age America. To those well enough to afford them, suburbs, with their quiet, tree-lined residential enclaves, offered escape from urban squalor and an easy commute to work by streetcar. Moreover, suburbs offered the privacy of a single-family home, difficult to come by in cities because of rising real estate prices and housing demands. Some exclusive neighborhoods also guaranteed that residents would live only among people like themselves, forbidding the sale of property to blacks, Roman Catholics, and Jews.